So here we are in April. Happy April. We are taking all of what we've been learning, and I know everyone is at different stages in their development, and I don't want you to get nervous about, feeling behind, but I want to start encouraging you as much as possible to take what you understand of the landscape so far, what you've gotten out of your stakeholder maps and your problem statements, and begin really talking with people, because April's really going to be all about getting to know the stakeholders as best as we can, so that by May we can really be prototyping and testing things with an informed knowledge about what we're doing and why. So as always, reach out to your mentor, reach out to me. I'll try to touch base. I think everyone on here, I try to touch base with the people without mentors, but always feel encouraged to do that, because it's hard to wrangle everyone and know what they need. And so today we're really just going to be speaking about what I call, I think I titled it user personas. It's also called design research personas. And the difference between those two terms are really inconsequential, except that user personas obviously is more focused on who's going to be using your product or service or program that you're making. And design research personas just sort of describes the purpose of what those personas are. So we're using them to research our product or solution. So we're just going to go over like what they are, why exactly you use them, and then some of how you can make them. And there's a lot of different ways that people go about this. I encourage you to just take this as a jumping off point. If you're interested in really learning more about user personas, I will share more materials and resources in the archive, and just a quick Google search will just bring you all sorts of different templates and principles around how to do that. And always encourage you to work offline, because especially if you're like a tactile learner, it's really nice to get off the screen and just write things down. And just a heads up that next week we'll be doing journey mapping. That I love journey maps. I think they're so incredibly useful. I use them for work all the time, and they're often what we get the feedback for as most useful for others who go through this program. So I encourage you to be there if you can. It'll also be recorded. And then the following week we'll have a staff from the Center for Advanced Hindsight join us to just give us some 101 around behavioral science. And so that's even just getting to know even more about how and why people do the things they do, and how you can think about interventions that approach maybe not the most logical, but the most realistic in behaviors and things like that. So a persona is an archetype. You use it to help guide decisions when you're building something out. So whether that's features of a product, or like how you're envisioning interactions or experiences, or even just choosing like the visual aspects of a design. So they are representatives of the goals and behaviors and motivations of real people. And so the important thing to note here is that it's best when you really base this on research and not just, taking grand guesses. And you'll see that might end up being a little bit harder than you think. So always keeping research in mind when you're doing this is going to be helpful and essential. So essentially, they are just synthesized from a series of interviews. So that's why it's important that you really get to know who your stakeholders are. You're going to start grabbing all that data, all of that information, those insights, and building them together so that they can kind of capture this one-page description. And I'll go into what that one pager sort of entails, but it's mainly going to include things like behavior patterns, goals that they have, skills that they might bring, attitudes, their environment, other kind of motivating factors that are relevant to the design that you're making. So this is where it can be really fun. You're like painting a picture so that you're not going in with this like blank slate of who am I designing for, but there's a really fine balance, and it's not necessarily, there's no strict rules about what should or shouldn't be in a persona, but it's all about what's useful to you to bring that to life. And so, like I said, you start with this big group of people that you've sort of identified themes around. Okay, there's a lot of interests here, challenges that are showing up. We can't get to know every single person throughout the process all the time. So it's nice to just build, a few small, concise descriptions of who those people are, as far as what goals they have, what behaviors they have, so that you can bring that with you so that you're not constantly getting lost in the woods with what you're designing. And, there's a lot of science around this. This is obviously just a very watered down way of saying, like, we empathize with people less than we do with groups. And the better we understand, who those people are, the better we feel like we can, work with them, build for them, and build with them. So when you have names attached, faces attached, personality traits of some kind, it's, it just brings it home rather than just putting this blank sort of user or backend, like those kind of vague terms that don't help us connect or help our other audience connect. When we're building these out, this is why they're called design research personas. So this is going to help us, like, when we're building out our prototypes, when we're anything that we're doing from here on out, the further we refine, we're going to take these personas with us. So nothing we do from here on out is going to be just built in a vacuum, and then the personas will just help us ground, always come back. They're like our not our North Star, but they're just our journey partners. And so when we're thinking about what we're making, we're thinking about how those interactions should take place. And then we're thinking about how the experiences and the lives of those people, of those personas, are going to help inform the future of what we're making for them. So while we do our best to work with and connect with real people along the way, those personas will be like placeholders as well, when we can't always co-create through every step with real life people. Oops. And there's different kinds of personas. And so the two main ones that we want to really just think about in regards to our goals, because there's also something, if you do Google, there's things called like market research personas, and those are similar, but sometimes they have different business goals associated with that. And so we really want to focus on the research personas. And so in that, we have our primary persona and our secondary persona. And that's really all I want us to focus on for this project. If you think back to your stakeholder maps, it's similar to that. You'll use that. The better you fill that out and the better you've been working with that, the easier it'll be to just create a personas, because you have all that information. Usually our primary personas are your key users. So they're the people that are really going to be directly benefiting from your design. They have the most interaction with it. They have the most to gain, and they potentially have the most to lose, or without a properly designed solution. Secondary persona, you can look at this in different ways, but one of the easier ways, and I think the most useful for us, will be to see them as the people that are needed to build the solution, but they might not be users themselves. So this could be people in the back end, other people from, let's say, another department or an organization that we're going to be leaning on. And so thinking back to that stakeholder map, it's more of your secondary stakeholders too. And this will come up along with the details of like how much detail to put in. It's not your goal to really get the full gamut of as much diversity of personas as possible, but it's really to help us focus. I mean, the real main point of having a persona in general is to help us focus on those most relevant needs, the challenges and motivations that are going to help you make this specific idea work better. And so just keep that in mind, because it will probably come up that you're like, oh, I do feel like I'm leaving someone out, because I know that will be something that probably emerges, like, who am I leaving out in my personas? I'm trying to get the full scope of everyone. There's also a few different ways to track your personas. And so just an easy way to differentiate between this is the minimal persona and the extended persona. And so at the very least, you want to have like the basic elements of who this person is. I'll show you more on the next slides, who they are, give them sort of like some basic demographics, and really focus on what they're trying to achieve, those relevant, like basic things about what they're doing, just paint a basic picture. The extended persona can really include a lot more. And this is where the slippery slope can start if you're not careful and you're having a little too much fun. But you can include the lifestyles, interests, hobbies, other sorts of characteristics that might impact your idea or how that persona relates to your idea. So always just ask when you're adding detail, like, how is this relevant to my solution? Even if adjacently, and then just try to limit the distracting details. And that's why it's nice to have it just on one page, so that you're not getting like multiple page resumes for these characters. And then, so these are a few personas that you might want to, principles that you might want to keep on hand. They are, when you're writing these behavioral patterns down, try not to make them so much like a list of like tasks or duties. Try to use that as a space to like paint the flow of someone's day. And so thinking about their skills, attitudes, environment, and goals. And I know this will look different depending on what kind of solution you're doing. So feel free to ask follow-up questions, but it's going to look a little bit different depending on the scope of your problem and how you're framing your solution. And so while you're adding life to the personas, remember that they are design tools. And so this is really what I was just saying on the last slide. You're going to focus on the information that's critical. So start there, and then maybe like sprinkle in a couple other details that are important. Maybe add a little bit more flavor to your persona, and then use them to reinforce the important characteristics that you want to keep in mind when you're building. Keep your persona set small. And so, like I said, 1 to 2 key stakeholders or primary personas, and then no more than a few secondary personas. I think to everyone's needs, at least for these ideas, you won't need more than 2 of each, I would think. With larger systems, like if you're, building a hospital system or rebuilding something that includes like many like interdisciplinary stakeholders, that's when things like get a little bit, you want to start breaking things into different buckets. But for all intents and purposes, we'll just keep them small. And then using the right goals. This is probably the most nuanced and like seemingly straightforward, but sort of difficult when you actually put pen to paper. You're going to try to focus on 3 to 4 important goals that help you focus your design. And so mainly you're going to be thinking about the end goals. That's the most important thing, because it's like, what does the person want to get out of your idea? Like, what is the goal that you're helping your person try to achieve? That's really the key thing that you should be worried about. There's also experience goals, and that's related because it shows you like how they want to feel when they're using a product. Like, what else kind of descriptively and maybe a little bit more subtly would they like to have going on when they're interacting with your product. I put life goals here because sometimes it's relevant, and it's often the most slippery, because you're going to want to put in goals maybe that they have in their life. Try to make sure if you put life goals that they're really, you have some sort of connection to, like the insight that they're giving to the product that you're creating. And so this is sort of a funny matrix, but I actually have found these really useful when I'm trying to think through qualities of like large groups of personas. So it's, I call them a 2x2 matrix. They're also called, I'm trying to think of different names that I've heard, quadrants, for just characteristic quadrants. And so basically you take all of that, synthesize those patterns that you're seeing in, whether it's behaviors, characteristics, sort of just qualities that have of just a lot of diversity. You're going to break up the strong ones into these 2 areas and then just see what fits in them. So I'm actually not good with dog types, but in this upper left quadrant, you have like analytical and low energy. And so like, what kind of persona fits in that section appropriately? And then on the right, you have the high energy analytical. What kind of persona fits in there? Bottom right, high energy emotional. Bottom left, low energy emotional. And this is sort of for you to decide what are the qualities that you want to play with. It just helps you sort of like think through before you make those personas, if you're having difficulty like differentiating. And you want to see differences in how you might create something for one versus the other. Binaries are limited, obviously, but this is just a categorizing tool that sort of helps build structure around our thinking. And so here's another example, younger versus older, individual versus group. So this might be, I grabbed this example from a past exercise. I think they were trying to build something like some kind of like product for traveling. So thinking about like a backpack, if someone's on a backpacking trip, how are we building for a younger individual, like a adventure traveler, a resilient seeker, a traveling foursome, or school field trippers. So just thinking through that can help you think through like the priorities that you want to design for. Let me just check my time. This is the template that I'm going to offer for you guys, and I'm putting it here because I think it's a good place to start, but I also want to encourage you to explore different kinds of qualities that you want to build out. But I've been giving you templates before, and I want you to feel like you can, if you filled this out and entered some information in here, that you'd have a good place to start. But I don't want to limit you to any particular template. If you want to do something else, there's so much out there. Ultimately, I'd love for you to build one primary persona and one secondary persona, and just play with it. Use your research to input, and otherwise just have fun. I love the quadrants sometimes, so feel free to use that. But I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to see if anyone has any questions.
I can always have a question. Or
Sure.
rather, I do always have questions.
Sean, please ask the questions.
Um, so I think one of the things, like I like the idea about user personas, but then I also end up thinking, well, like when do you use user personas and when do you, um, you know, use specific real users? Like, I guess one of the things I've heard about is, like if you're doing, like Katie's doing like website testing, that, you really only have to talk to a few people to get their feedback about the usability of your site, before you start hearing redundancies. So like, what's the advantage of this abstracted person versus a real person? And I think part of the reason I ask is I feel like, um, I know some people would sort of think like, well, now you're just sort of making this person up. Like, how do you know you're not making this person up that doesn't reflect, where you sort of gone down some road that doesn't work to your advantage?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And so I'll say the caveat or the disclaimer for me is I don't necessarily use personas in all of my work. That's I do think they're useful, especially, and I had Katie in mind actually, because I think a lot of times when we're trying to incorporate design solutions that are trying to respond to someone who's maybe really tech savvy, versus someone who's not. And there's different aspects of how different users engage. And we might not have an idea of where those differences lie. And so for Katie, for instance, with user testing, choosing those big, especially like with the quadrants, for instance, like if you choose big differences where you're like, these are two qualities that are going to make a difference in how I think about what problems I'm focusing on first. Let's say what problems I'm first trying to solve, because there might be a whole number of them, and that's going to come from your research. I'm not expecting Katie to do 40 interviews. Although if a survey might be helpful, and then that will give you some more information about a broader amount of people than you might be able to interview specifically. It's I mean, the annoying answer is also it depends on your comfort with personas, and just you kind of have to muddle through. And so sometimes, depending on how you use them, or if you're in a room by yourself using them, they might not be as useful as if you have a team or of a few people trying to understand and come together and align when they're building on something. It's an alignment tool as well. So it's like a communication, not just it's sitting in my head about making assumptions about who I'm designing for, but it's like made explicit and it's always available to refer to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that helps a lot. Thanks.
Yeah. And I know we talked a lot, but do we have another question?
I was going to ask about, you mentioned sort of for the purpose of this project, you don't want to have too many user personas. So I think in the case of the website, like you could get into a lot of different user personas. Like one person is a business owner, one person's a resident who wants to pay their water bill. There's a lot because we have so much content. So for the purpose of this project, do you think it is better to just say like, I'm going to focus for this one on like your average resident who's trying to pay their water, do specific resident type tasks. And like for this, I'm not going to worry about, yeah, we do have business owners that look for information. We also have people building a shed in their yard. We have, contractors. Like for this, just pick an audience to kind of focus on and not try to get overwhelmed with too many different types of users.
Right. I'm glad you asked that, because Sean actually mentioned some of these research questions. I think for that, you're going to want to make executive decisions about where to start. And that will come out of priorities that you're making based on the research that you've been hearing. And you just have to put a stake in the ground and then choose, because you're not going to be able to do everyone at once. And that's the nice thing about a prototype too. It's like, if you solve this problem for this subset of users, that actually will probably trickle into a solution that we can then solve for, user group 2. But you just have to sort of chunk it down. Otherwise, you're trying to solve all the problems at once and not necessarily solving any, or you're not able to track the metrics. Like, are we successful? But I think we have a little team chat, and so we can talk through that and exactly those questions.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So actually, can you talk a little bit more about how you use the user personas for alignment?
Right. So, and the example that comes to my mind is when I was on a team of 5 building a technology solution. Building a solution that ended up using technology for a number of individuals who were relying on a state financed service for people with disabilities to stay in their home. And so I did some interviews, and then I had different team members that were doing different interviews. And then when we compiled all of that information and all that data, we were starting to notice, we did the pattern recognition with each other. So we're like, here's some themes, here's what we should prioritize. And it's just a visual tool of saying, here's where we're putting those themes and how we're going to move forward with them so that we don't get lost in the sauce. Because I can't stay in 4 other team members' heads. And it can also be a mechanism so that it's not just, you don't end up, bickering back and forth about what to prioritize every time you're making a design choice. You always go back to, well, we stated here, this is, a relevant thing that we need to look out for. Are we trying to solve for this or not? So that's why it's sort of your North Star, especially when you're working with others.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sure there's other reasons too, but that one was the first important one.
I know we have this separate meeting next week, but I was thinking that defining the tech comfort for the user is going to be helpful, because I do think while there would be useful feedback from somebody who's not tech savvy, for the case of this project, I'm kind of thinking the experience that's going to be captured, like apply to the most people, is going to be somebody who is comfortable using a computer or using the internet. We might identify issues for somebody that isn't comfortable on a computer, but it probably going to be a different type of issue, like, maybe not knowing how to open up an internet browser. That's very different than being on our website and not finding. So I was thinking that the definition about like the level of comfort with technology is probably going to be an important part of my user persona.
Yep, I think exactly right. Probably more than other ideas in the group. Yeah. And we'll use journey maps, will support that too. But I think the most thing that will support you right now is confirming, validating, or challenging the assumptions that you are going in with as much as you can. So just talking to people.